a crisis to crisis model that demands that we continue to pile on more and more debt while diluting the value of the currency, right? And this does not only apply in the United States, it applies in the EU, it applies all over the world. For every unit of that currency, for every dollar that they print out of thin air, every existing dollar that you have has less value. How is that a fair system, right? For all the talk of equity and wanting to make things fair and fixing inequality, might all of that talk just be a big smoke and mirrors distraction for where the real inequality is? The real corruption, the real fraud, right? Because when we have a crisis to crisis model, we're talking about endless disasters, whether imagined or real, which may be wars, they may be pandemics, they may be global warming or energy crises. So as these circumstances of crisis expand and then are responded to by dictates from governments to say, oh, well, our solution is going to be, oh, we're going to print more money. And just keep in mind all of the various euphemisms for printing more money, right? The reality is that printing more money, what that really means is pulling money from the future into the now. And what does that mean? That means slavery. Because who's paying for that? Working people, taxpayers are paying for that, right? A central bank doesn't just get to go create money out of thin air magically and then nobody pays for it. No, that's the whole nature of the fraud. That's the whole nature of the scam. They create that money and then the working people pay for it. Everybody who's already worried about the price of food, already worried about the price of gas, it's already getting out of control. And then we're the ones who get to pay for it, right? So the problem with this whole system is that it's a crisis to crisis model where nobody is held accountable. You have an unaccountable private institution in the U.S. known as the Federal Reserve, in the EU, well, the European Central Bank, masquerading as a government institution. They're not. They're a private entity. Basically wreaking all this havoc and creating a situation of debt slavery for everybody, and then diverting the blame from themselves onto these myriad crises, right? Again, whether it's a war, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a climate crisis, whether it's an energy crisis, anything but the people who are actually creating the problem. And so this crisis to crisis model, as I presented in an earlier video about a week ago, is a greater threat to human life, to human civilization, to society, to civil society, to life as we know it, than nuclear Armageddon. Because you see, this crisis to crisis model doesn't function in the way war does. It doesn't function in a way where a war is a reactionary. Just look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? One side does this, and then Russia turns around and starts sending interballistic missiles, and it's a retaliatory process. A crisis-to-crisis model initiated by central banks is very hard for the uninformed public to understand what's actually going on. And more and more people are starting to understand and see what's going on, but this is a much more insidious process by which whole nations are basically starved of their, not starved, but whole nations are basically their resources are funneled off from productivity that they have access to into some other entity, and then it goes, well, where did it go? Where did all the productivity go, right? And people blame that on outsourcing, which I don't really believe that that's the whole problem, right? People say, oh, well, the problem is that the U.S. it outsourced all of its manufacturing to China and Taiwan. No, that's not the problem, because that was, however you want to look at that, that was a mutually beneficial economic arrangement for both parties, right? Because say that China was able to produce a camping chair in China cheaper than it was able to be produced in the U.S., well, then that labor that would have had to be used to make that camping chair in the U.S. was able to be put towards something else, right? So productivity increased on both sides. The labor in China got paid for it, and both parties benefited. Now, I'm not saying that that's how it has worked all of the time. It's not a simple black and white issue. However, the presumption that the whole problem is that U.S. manufacturing was outsourced to other countries is a bit of an oversimplification, because it did benefit both parties at certain times. But where we are now in this crisis to crisis model, where productivity is basically, here's the word I was looking for. Productivity is drained and leached from a society, whether it be the U.S. or any other sovereign nation. Leached from that nation, out of that nation, and then that nation is then transferred from a productive producer into a basically debt-based model which enslaves that nation.